Hello everybody, this is Matt, developer of Streets of Rogue 2, and this is Devlog number 3. I was hoping to do this as a monthly series, but as it turns out, I have a game to finish, or at least get into early access. Anyways, for this devlog, I wanted to talk about some of the specific games that I have played over the years that have had a really significant influence on Streets of Rogue 2. Okay, so jumping right into it, around the time the original Streets of Rogue came out into early access, I released a Making of Streets of Rogue DLC, and one of the videos that was in it mentioned a bunch of games that were really big influences on me. Now for this video right here, I wanted to mostly focus on stuff that specifically influenced the sequel, Streets of Rogue 2, but I also wanted to cover the games from the older video briefly because, you know, those are still super important to Streets of Rogue 2 being what it is. So first off is the original Fallout. You know, running around towns, doing quests, generally helping or hurting things, making choices, making an impact. Lots of fun, great stuff, you know, classic obviously. Streets of Rogue 1 tried to sort of take that feeling and distill it into something more streamlined and action-oriented, you know, which is still true of Streets of Rogue 2. But Streets of Rogue 2 is a, you know, a much more long-form RPG than the original game was, which means that it's actually closer to my original vision. In Streets 1, once you're done with a level, you know, it's like you're done with it, and all the mayhem that you caused and all the stuff you did, it's like it never happened, you know. You never go back there. With the sequel, locations continue to exist whether you're there or not, you know, and the choices that you made and the impact that you've had are going to be, you know, longer and further reaching than previously. Deus Ex, pretty much the primary reference point when you think about games with systems-driven immersion gameplay. It's everybody's favorite immersive sim. Streets of Rogue wouldn't exist without this, blah blah blah, whatever. I mean, even though nowadays it's probably best known just for JC Denton memes.
What's that computer system for? The one with the blue face for an interface.
It's a blue screen?
Yes.
What a shame. Messiah, a fairly obscure, flawed, interesting game. The main mechanic was that you could take over people's bodies, just like, you know, regular people with regular professions. But the idea wasn't really developed all that well, and you couldn't really do very many interesting things with those characters aside from, you know, usually just entering a door that you couldn't previously or something like that. Like, they were essentially human key cards. So that kind of inspired me to want to try that concept again, but in my own way. And actually the main character in Messiah is essentially the shapeshifter from Streets of Rogue. But Messiah is probably best known nowadays for being the original source of the Roblox oof sound. And finally, Grand Theft Auto 2. This is the first time that I experienced a true chaos simulator. As a kid, I would just replay the 5-minute demo of the game just over and over because that was really all the time you needed to see the best part of the game. And with Streets of Rogue, I really just wanted to recreate those feelings I got playing that just with my own spin on it. Alright, so moving on to games that directly inspired Streets of Rogue 2. The first game I wanted to talk about is Sid Meier's Pirates. Now this is really one of those OG open world games. The original version came out all the way back in 1987 at a point when there really was no template for what an open world game could or should be. And since then there's been just tons of ports and remakes of this game, the most recent major revision being in 2004, which is just already 20 years ago, holy crap. And that's the one that I'm most familiar with. Anyways, unlike most modern open world games that get released nowadays, Pirates is generally not a game that you're meant to play for dozens of hours on a single character. Games tend to be a lot shorter, like in the 5 to 10 hour range, or sometimes even less. It's meant to be replayed. Now granted, it's not as extensive of an open world as you're probably used to in the modern era, and the moment-to-moment gameplay doesn't really resemble modern open world games at all. But I like a lot of what it does from a structural standpoint. I mean, you can really just jump in and get a lot of pirating done really quickly and make a lot of good progress really quickly. You know, within 10 minutes on starting a new game, you could sail into town, get word from a bartender that there's a treasure-carrying ship on a certain trade route, go sink that ship and steal the treasure, upgrade your ship. Then maybe one of the local governors likes that because they were at war with the faction whose ship you sunk. And then you get to go to the ball with the governor's daughter, and then she rejects you because you suck at dancing. So this game is proof positive that starting a new game in an open world title doesn't have to feel like this huge, daunting thing. And that's something that I want for Streets of Rogue 2. I want you to want to start a new game because, you're excited about all the possibilities that a clean slate with a brand new character class can bring. And I want players to be able to make cool things happen even really early on, like during their play session. Another thing that I really like about Pirates is that the world feels very alive and very malleable. Like oftentimes during the game you'll get notifications like the French have declared war on Spain, or you might be passing by a city and actually get to witness a ship attacking that city. And that attack might actually affect things like, the price of goods in that city. And then you as the player can also influence how world events pan out. It's not like a super complicated simulation, but there's enough there to make you feel like you're a part of something bigger, and that the world doesn't revolve just specifically around you and doesn't need you to exist. And that's a feeling that I want to get across in Streets of Rogue 2. NPCs, like for example, have their own lives. Factions can gain or lose influence over certain areas of the map. You'll see random fights breaking out as a result of faction-related conflicts. And you'll actually get to influence all this stuff yourself if you want to. Or if you don't, I guess you don't have to. And even if you don't, in that case, you'll still feel it. You'll feel like you're playing within a world that's really alive. The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. This came out in 1996, and I remember getting a demo of this thing on the PC Gamer demo disc that came with the magazine every month. And this demo was just stupidly enormous. Like, in terms of the sheer scope of explorable area, it is without a doubt the biggest demo I've ever played by a pretty wide margin. And that tracks with the full game because, according to Wikipedia, the game world for Daggerfall comprises over 200,000 square kilometers, has 15,000 towns and cities, and has a population of 750,000. So even though the demo was only a small portion of that, it was still huge. And as a kid, I don't think I had any idea how they pulled that off. But now, I see it as this really interesting early example of procedural generation being used to create this massive RPG world. And it's actually a big part of what sparked my interest in creating my own massive proc-gen world. Because it actually felt like a real large livable countryside, as opposed to like a sort of heavily curated little slice of game world. And I briefly considered trying to make Streets of Rogue 2 at a similar landmass scope to Daggerfall, but ultimately I felt like it'd make for a better game if you weren't essentially like required to fast travel everywhere because the world map is just so huge. I'd rather the player be able to actually drive from one end of the map rather than just theoretically drive from one end of the map, because like something that huge, only the most hardcore of the hardcore are going to actually attempt that. Now, Daggerfall was obviously really, really ambitious, but also, at least in its original incarnation, it is a great way to learn how procedural generation on this scale can go wrong, like really wrong. When the game first came out, it was notoriously buggy. I think one of the funniest things that ever happened to me in a video game, like ever, was I remember just going into a house and they offered me a quest that says like, okay, a bear has invaded the Ambrose residence. Can you please go and kill the bear? Okay, so I accept, and I take a look at my map to try and find the Ambrose residence. I'm currently standing in the Ambrose residence. I turn around and there's a giant bear in my face. Yeah, so he had apparently just spawned in after I took the quest, because I assume the game's code just didn't specify that a quest target shouldn't originate in the same location as the quest giver. Unfortunately, not all of the bugs were of the funny/janky variety. You could be sent on a very lengthy procedurally generated dungeon quest to find an item, and it turns out that the item just doesn't exist. The procedural generation just messed up somehow, and now you just wasted your time and you can't finish the quest. Which did happen to me, and it totally put me off from the game. And I think that gave me an early lesson in just how crucial it is for this aspect of the game to be really, really polished. Dealing with edge cases that cause the sort of bugs that I mentioned is a very non-trivial part of development for me. And this was also true of the original Streets of Rogue, but it's even more difficult and more critical in an open world game. You know, if someone experiences a game-breaking procedural generation bug in a game like Streets of Rogue 1, you know, it sucks, but ultimately it's not a huge deal because the runs in the game are so short. But in a more long-form game like Streets of Rogue 2, it's really bad for players if something like that happens. So a lot of my effort and development time goes toward making sure that the procedural generation goes smoothly for everybody. Because like seriously, you have no idea how much time is spent just making sure that bears are not able to break the laws of time and space, and let me assure you, they really want to. So actually, Bethesda games in general have had a pretty big influence on how Streets of Rogue 2's world systems function. One of the big things that separates Bethesda games from other open world games is the level of persistence in their worlds. You know, in a game like Grand Theft Auto 5, if you go on a rampage and you cause a bunch of destruction, kill a bunch of people, you can leave and come back in a bit and there's just no evidence whatsoever that anything ever happened in that spot. Now with Bethesda games, you have the ability to actually alter an environment permanently, whether that be, you know, filling an entire room with watermelons in Oblivion, or killing random people who will then stay dead and, you know, remain in a spot where you left them for all eternity. And this contributes to the feeling that you're actually in a solid world that reacts to your actions. So in Streets of Rogue 2, I wanted to make sure that essentially any action that you take, or actions that NPCs take, or just stuff that randomly happens and causes a change to the world, is going to get accounted for and saved. That was really important to me, and it's something that I've been consistently working on, you know, right from the beginning of development, so thankfully that system is in quite good shape. Realistically, you know, for example, a dead body in the middle of the city isn't just going to stay there forever in any sort of real-ish world. I mentioned in a previous devlog that butler bots will come around every morning and clean up a lot of the messes that get made. But there will be cases where this is preventable, and definitely a mutator to turn off the butler bots entirely. Another thing I get asked a lot is, will NPCs ever respawn if they get killed? And the answer to that is no, but someone else might move into their house and take their place, and take their job. There's a lot to account for if you want to have this sort of persistence and also maintain at least a semi-believable simulated world. Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead is an open-world, procedurally generated game that most resembles a traditional roguelike, given its extensive control scheme and the way it looks and the fact that it's turn-based. So, you know, I love the systemic complexity of this game and the wide variety of character classes, you know, many of which, like in Streets of Rogue, are just kind of like real-world professions. You know, if you're really into open-ended, complicated, systems-driven games and you don't mind the lack of like real goals other than survive, and you're okay with dying a lot while you're learning the ropes, definitely check this out. So CDDA, as the acronym goes, has definitely had an impact on how I've approached creating an open-world, procedurally generated game, especially given that there actually aren't that many open-world, procedurally generated games out there. I think most notably, this game actually does something with its procedurally generated world that I don't see any other games doing. And I mean, maybe there's something else out there that I totally missed, please let me know. But this game actually creates a modern-day open world as opposed to a medieval fantasy world or something, which includes, you know, a procedural town and city layouts that include roads that interconnect those cities, roadside buildings. You know, it feels like that sort of thing should exist somewhere else, but I don't think it does. You know, when I was trying to create a modern-day world procedurally in Streets of Rogue 2, this was pretty much the only frame of reference I had for, you know, games that had done it in the past. And ultimately, I ended up with a world that looks and functions and procedurally generates a lot differently than this game's. But as a starting point for determining my direction and, you know, what the world could look like, this was really useful. So on the aesthetic side of things, there was one major influence on Streets of Rogue aside from, you know, obviously the original game. When my artist Thomas signed on to this project and we were trying to nail down a style, I told him, you know, if we can make this game look anywhere close to the level of Stoneshard, but much less grimdark, that would be amazing. Stoneshard is, in my view, one of, if not the best looking game done in a 3/4 perspective that exists. I'm just in awe of this thing. I think it's remarkable looking. Now, there are a lot of other games that have had some sort of impact on Streets of Rogue 2. Anytime I play something or watch videos of something that seems like it's even in the same general ballpark of this game, I like to take down a lot of notes on things that I think work well or don't work well, or just seem cool or not cool. And while I would love to discuss all of these games that I take notes on, it is once again 2 a.m. And I have a 4-year-old son who thinks it is hilarious to wake me up early a lot of the time. And you know what? He's not wrong. Comedy is subjective. He also says he's working on Streets of Rogue 3. I haven't seen any proof of that, but then again, I haven't seen anything to disprove it either, so if you want to know about the future of the franchise, I guess ask that guy. Anyways, see you next time.